At 600 yards from the well, and circularly arranged around it as a central point, rose 1,200 reverberating ovens, each 6 feet in diameter, and separated from each other by an interval of 3 feet. The circumference occupied by these 1,200 ovens presented a length of 2 miles. Being all constructed on the same plan, each with its high quadrangular chimney, they produced a most singular effect. It will be remembered that on their third meeting the committee had decided to use cast iron for the Columbiad, and in particular the white description. This metal, in fact, is the most tenacious, the most ductile and the most malleable, and consequently suitable for all molding operations, and when smelted with pit coal, is of superior quality for all engineering works requiring great resisting power, such as cannon, steam boilers, hydraulic presses, and the like. Cast iron, however, if subjected to only one single fusion, is rarely sufficiently homogeneous, and it requires a second fusion completely to refine it by dispossessing it of its last earthly deposits. So long before being forwarded to Tampa Town, the iron ore, molten in the great furnaces of Cold Spring and brought into contact with coal and silicium heated to a high temperature, was carburized and transformed into cast iron. After this first operation, the metal was sent on to Stones Hill. They had, however, to deal with 136 million pounds of iron, a quantity far too costly to send by railway. The cost of transport would have been double that of material. It appeared preferable to freight vessels at New York and to load them with the iron in bars. This, however, required not less than 68 vessels of 1,000 tons, a veritable fleet, which, quitting New York on the 3rd of May, on the 10th of the same month ascended the Bay of Espiritu Santo and discharged their cargoes without dues in the port at Tampa Town. Thence the iron was transported by rail to Stones Hill, and about the middle of January this enormous mass of metal was delivered at its destination. It will easily be understood that 1,200 furnaces were not too many to melt simultaneously these 60,000 tons of iron. Each of these furnaces contained nearly 140,000 pounds weight of metal. They were all built after the model of those which served for the casting of the Rodman gun. They were trapezoidal in shape, with a high elliptical arch. These furnaces, constructed of fireproof brick, were especially adapted for burning pit coal, with a flat bottom upon which the iron bars were laid. This bottom, inclined at an angle of 25 degrees, allowed the metal to flow into the receiving troughs, and the 1,200 converging trenches carried the molten metal down to the central well. The day following that on which the works of the masonry and boring had been completed, Barbicane set to work upon the central mold. His object now was to raise within the center of the well, and with a coincident axis, a cylinder 900 feet high and 9 feet in diameter, which should exactly fill up the space reserved for the bore of the Columbiad. This cylinder was composed of a mixture of clay and sand, with the addition of a little hay and straw. The space left between the mold and the masonry was intended to be filled up by the molten metal, which would thus form the walls 6 feet in thickness. This cylinder, in order to maintain its equilibrium, had to be bound by iron bands and firmly fixed at certain intervals by cross-clamps fastened into the stone lining. After the castings, these would be buried in the block of metal, leaving no external projection. This operation was completed on the 8th of July, and the run of the metal was fixed for the following day. "This fate of the casting will be a grand ceremony," said J.T. Maston to his friend Barbicane. "Undoubtedly," said Barbicane, "but it will not be a public fete." "What, will you not open the gates of the enclosure to all comers?" "I must be very careful, Maston. The casting of the Columbiad is an extremely delicate, not to say a dangerous operation, and I should prefer its being done privately. At the discharge of the projectile, a fete if you like. Till then, no." The President was right. The operation involved unforeseen dangers, which a great influx of spectators would have hindered him from averting. It was necessary to preserve complete freedom of movement. No one was admitted within the enclosure except a delegation of members of the Gun Club who had made the voyage to Tampa Town. Among these was the brisk Bilsby, Tom Hunter, Colonel Blomsbury, Major Elphinstone, General Morgan, and the rest of the lot to whom the casting of the Columbiad was a matter of personal interest. J.T. Maston became their cicerone. He omitted no point of detail. He conducted them throughout the magazines, workshops, through the midst of the engines, and compelled them to visit the whole 1,200 furnaces one after the other. At the end of the 1,200th visit, they were pretty well knocked up. The casting was to take place at 12 o'clock precisely. The previous evening, each furnace had been charged with 114,000 pounds weight of metal in bars disposed crossways to each other, so as to allow the hot air to circulate freely between them. At daybreak, the 1,200 chimneys vomited their torrents of flame into the air, and the ground was agitated with dull tremblings. As many pounds of metal as there were to cast, so many pounds of coal were there to burn. Thus, there were 68,000 tons of coal, which projected in the face of the sun a thick curtain of smoke. The heat soon became insupportable within the circle of furnaces, the rumbling of which resembled the rolling of thunder. The powerful ventilators added their continuous blasts and saturated with oxygen the glowing plates. The operation, to be successful, required to be conducted with great rapidity. On a signal given by a cannon shot, each furnace was to give vent to the molten iron and completely to empty itself. These arrangements made, foremen and workmen waited the preconcerted moment with an impatience mingled with a certain amount of emotion. Not a soul remained within the enclosure. Each superintendent took his post by the aperture of the run. Barbicane and his colleagues, perched on a neighboring eminence, assisted at the operation. In front of them was a piece of artillery ready to give fire on the signal from the engineer. Some minutes before midday, the first driblets of metal began to flow. The reservoirs filled little by little, and by the time that the whole melting was completely accomplished, it was kept in abeyance for a few minutes in order to facilitate the separation of foreign substances. 12 o'clock struck. A gunshot suddenly pealed forth and shot its flame into the air. 1,200 melting troughs were simultaneously opened, and 1,200 fiery serpents crept toward the central well, unrolling their incandescent curves. There down they plunged with a terrific noise into a depth of 900 feet. It was an exciting and a magnificent spectacle. The ground trembled, while these molten waves, launching into the sky their wreaths of smoke, evaporated the moisture of the mold and hurled it upward through the vent holes of the stone lining in the form of dense vapor clouds. These artificial clouds unrolled their thick spirals to a height of 1,000 yards into the air. A savage, wandering somewhere beyond the limits of the horizon, might have believed that some new crater was forming in the bosom of Florida, although there was neither any eruption, nor typhoon, nor storm, nor struggle of the elements, nor any of those terrible phenomena which nature is capable of producing. No, it was man alone who had produced these reddish vapors, these gigantic flames worthy of a volcano itself, these tremendous vibrations resembling the shock of an earthquake, these reverberations rivaling those of hurricanes and storms. And it was his hand which precipitated into an abyss, dug by himself, a whole Niagara of molten metal. Chapter 16. The Columbiad. Had the casting succeeded, they were reduced to mere conjecture. There was indeed every reason to expect success, since the mold has absorbed the entire mass of the molten metal. Still, some considerable time must elapse before they could arrive at any certainty upon the matter. The patience of the members of the gun club was sorely tried during this period of time, but they could do nothing. J.T. Maston escaped roasting by a miracle. 15 days after the casting, an immense column of smoke was still rising in the open sky, and the ground burned the soles of the feet within a radius of 200 feet round the summit of Stones Hill. It was impossible to approach nearer. All they could do was to wait with what patience they might. "Here we are at the 10th of August, exclaimed J.T. Maston one morning, "only 4 months to the 1st of December. We shall never be ready in time." Barbicane said nothing, but his silence covered serious irritation. However, daily observations revealed a certain change going on in the state of the ground. About the 15th of August, the vapors ejected had sensibly diminished in intensity and thickness. Some days afterward, the earth exhaled only a slight puff of smoke, the last breath of the monster enclosed within its circle of stone. Little by little, the belt of heat contracted, until on the 22nd of August, Barbicane, his colleagues, and the engineer were enabled to set foot on the iron sheet, which lay level upon the summit of Stones Hill. "At last," exclaimed the president of the Gun Club with an immense sigh of relief. The work was resumed the same day. They proceeded at once to extract the interior mold for the purpose of clearing out the boring of the piece. Pickaxes and boring irons were set to work without intermission. The clay and sandy soils had acquired extreme hardness under the action of the heat, but by the aid of the machines, the rubbish on being dug out was rapidly carted away on railway wagons, and such was the ardor of the work, so persuasive the arguments of Barbicane's dollars, that by the 3rd of September all traces of the mold had entirely disappeared. Immediately the operation of boring was commenced, and by the aid of powerful machines, a few weeks later, the inner surface of the immense tube had been rendered perfectly cylindrical, and the bore of the piece had acquired a thorough polish. At length, on the 22nd of September, less than a 12-month after Barbicane's original proposition, the enormous weapon, accurately bored and exactly vertically pointed, was ready for work. There was only the moon now to wait for, and they were pretty sure that she would not fail in the rendezvous. The ecstasy of J.T. Maston knew no bounds, and he narrowly escaped a frightful fall while staring down the tube. But for the strong hand of Colonel Blomsberry, the worthy secretary, like a modern Erostratus, would have found his death in the depths of the Columbiad. The cannon was then finished. There was no possible doubt as to its perfect completion. So, on the 6th of October, Captain Nicholl opened an account between himself and President Barbicane, in which he debited himself to the latter in the sum of $2,000. One may believe that the captain's wrath was increased to its highest point, and must have made him seriously ill. However, he had still 3 bets of $3,000, $4,000, and $5,000 respectively, and if he gained 2 out of these, his position would not be very bad. But the money question did not enter into his calculations. It was the success of his rival in casting a cannon against which iron plates 60 feet thick would have been ineffectual that dealt him a terrible blow. After the 23rd of September, the enclosure of Stones Hill was thrown open to the public, and it will be easily imagined what was the concourse of visitors to this spot. There was an incessant flow of people to and from Tampa town and the place, which resembled a procession, or rather, in fact, a pilgrimage. It was already clear to be seen that, on the day of the experiment itself, the aggregate of spectators would be counted by millions, for they were already arriving from all parts of the earth upon this narrow strip of promontory. Europe was emigrating to America. Up to that time, however, it must be confessed, the curiosity of the numerous comers was but scantily gratified. Most had counted upon witnessing the spectacle of the casting, and they were treated to nothing but smoke. This was sorry food for hungry eyes, but Barbicane would admit no one to that operation. Then ensued grumbling, discontent, murmurs. They blamed the president, taxed him with dictatorial conduct. His proceedings were declared un-American. There was very nearly a riot round Stones Hill, but Barbicane remained inflexible. When, however, the Columbiad was entirely finished, this state of closed doors could no longer be maintained. Besides, it would have been bad taste, and even imprudence, to affront the public feeling. Barbicane, therefore, opened the enclosure to all comers, but true to his practical disposition, he determined to coin money out of the public curiosity. It was something, indeed, to be enabled to contemplate this immense Columbiad, but to descend into its depths, this seemed to the Americans the ne plus ultra of earthly felicity. Consequently, there was not one curious spectator who was not willing to give himself the treat of visiting the interior of this great metallic abyss. Baskets suspended from steam cranes permitted them to satisfy their curiosity. There was a perfect mania. Women, children, old men, all made it a point of duty to penetrate the mysteries of the colossal gun. The fare for the descent was fixed at $5 per head, and despite this high charge, during the 2 months which preceded the experiment, the influx of visitors enabled the Gun Club to pocket nearly $500,000. It is needless to say that the first visitors of the Columbiad were the members of the Gun Club. This privilege was justly reserved for that illustrious body. The ceremony took place on the 25th of September. A basket of honor took down the president, J.T. Maston, Major Elphinstone, General Morgan, Colonel Blomsberry, and other members of the club, to the number of 10 in all. How hot it was at the bottom of that long tube of metal. They were half suffocated. But what delight, what ecstasy! A table had been laid with 6 covers on the massive stone which formed the bottom of the Columbiad, and lighted by a jet of electric light resembling that of day itself. Numerous exquisite dishes, which seemed to descend from heaven, were placed successively before the guests, and the richest wines of France flowed in profusion during this splendid repast, served 900 feet beneath the surface of the earth. The festival was animated, not to say somewhat noisy. Toasts flew backward and forward. They drank to the earth and to her satellite, to the Gun Club, the Union, the Moon, Diana, Phoebe, Selene, the peaceful courier of the night. All the hurrahs, carried upward upon the sonorous waves of the immense acoustic tube, arrived with the sound of thunder at its mouth, and the multitude ranged round Stone's Hill heartily united their shouts with those of the 10 revelers hidden from view at the bottom of the gigantic Columbiad. J.T. Maston was no longer master of himself. Whether he shouted or gesticulated, ate or drank most, would be a difficult matter to determine. At all events, he would not have given his place up for an empire, not even if the cannon, loaded, primed, and fired at that very moment, were to blow him in pieces into the planetary world. Chapter 17. A Telegraphic Dispatch. The great works undertaken by the Gun Club had now virtually come to an end, and 2 months still remained before the day for the discharge of the shot to the moon. To the general impatience, these 2 months appeared as long as years. Hitherto, the smallest details of the operation had been daily chronicled by the journals, which the public devoured with eager eyes. Just at this moment, a circumstance, the most unexpected, the most extraordinary and incredible, occurred to rouse afresh their panting spirits, and to throw every mind into a state of the most violent excitement. One day, the 30th of September at 3:47 p.m., a telegram, transmitted by cable from Valentia, Ireland, to Newfoundland and the American mainland, arrived at the address of President Barbicane. The President tore open the envelope, read the dispatch, and despite his remarkable powers of self-control, his lips turned pale and his eyes grew dim on reading the 20 words of this telegram. Here is the text of the dispatch, which figures now in the archives of the Gun Club. France, Paris, 30 September, 4 a.m. Barbicane, Tampa Town, Florida, United States. Substitute for your spherical shell a cylindro-conical projectile. I shall go inside. Shall arrive by steamer Atlanta. Mitchell Arden. Chapter 18. The Passenger of the Atlanta. If this astounding news, instead of flying through the electric wires, had simply arrived by post in the ordinary sealed envelope, Barbicane would not have hesitated a moment. He would have held his tongue about it, both as a measure of prudence and in order not to have to reconsider his plans. This telegram might be a cover for some jest, especially as it came from a Frenchman. What human being would ever have conceived the idea of such a journey? And if such a person really existed, he must be an idiot, whom one would shut up in a lunatic ward, rather than within the walls of the projectile. The contents of the dispatch, however, speedily became known, for the telegraphic officials possessed but little discretion, and Mitchell Arden's proposition ran at once throughout the several states of the Union. Barbicane had, therefore, no further motives for keeping silence. Consequently, he called together such of his colleagues as were at the moment in Tampa Town, and without any expression of his own opinions, simply read to them the laconic text itself. It was received with every possible variety of expressions of doubt, incredulity, and derision from everyone, with the exception of J.T. Maston, who exclaimed, "It is a grand idea, however." When Barbicane originally proposed to send a shot to the moon, everyone looked upon the enterprise as simple and practicable enough, a mere question of gunnery. But when a person, professing to be a reasonable being, offered to take passage within the projectile, the whole thing became a farce, or, in plainer language, a humbug. One question, however, remained. Did such a being exist? This telegram flashed across the depths of the Atlantic, the designation of the vessel on board which he was to take his passage, the date assigned for his speedy arrival, all combined to impart a certain character of reality to the proposal. They must get some clearer notion of the matter. Scattered groups of inquirers at length condensed themselves into a compact crowd, which made straight for the residence of President Barbicane. That worthy individual was keeping quiet with the intention of watching events as they arose. But he had forgotten to take into account the public impatience, and it was with no pleasant countenance that he watched the population of Tampa Town gathering under his windows. The murmurs and vociferations below presently obliged him to appear. He came forward, therefore, and on silence being procured, a citizen put point-blank to him the following question: "Is the person mentioned in the telegram under the name of Mitchell Arden on his way here? Yes or no?" "Gentlemen," replied Barbicane, "I know no more than you do." "We must know," roared the impatient voices. "Time will show," calmly replied the president. "Time has no business to keep a whole country in suspense," replied the orator. "Have you altered the plans of the projectile according to the request of the telegram?" "Not yet, gentlemen, but you are right. We must have better information to go by. The telegraph must complete its information." "To the telegraph," roared the crowd. Barbicane descended, and heading the immense assemblage, led the way to the telegraph office. A few minutes later, a telegram was dispatched to the secretary of the underwriters at Liverpool, requesting answers to the following queries. About the ship Atlanta, when did she leave Europe? Had she on board a Frenchman named Mitchell Arden? 2 hours afterward, Barbicane received information too exact to leave room for the smallest remaining doubt. The steamer Atlanta from Liverpool put to sea on the 2nd of October, bound for Tampa Town, having on board a Frenchman born on the list of passengers by the name of Mitchell Arden. That very evening, he wrote to the house of Breadwill and Co., requesting them to suspend the casting of the projectile until the receipt of further orders. On the 10th of October, at 9 a.m., the semaphores of the Bahama Canal signaled a thick smoke on the horizon. 2 hours later, a large steamer exchanged signals with them. The name of the Atlanta flew at once over Tampa Town. At 4 o'clock, the English vessel entered the Bay of Espiritu Santo. At 5, it crossed the passage of Hillsborough Bay at full steam. At 6, she cast anchor at Port Tampa. The anchor had scarcely caught the sandy bottom when 500 boats surrounded the Atlanta, and the steamer was taken by assault. Barbicane was the first to set foot on deck, and in a voice of which he vainly tried to conceal the emotion, called Mitchell Arden. "Here," replied an individual perched on the poop. Barbicane, with arms crossed, looked fixedly at the passenger of the Atlanta. He was a man of about 42 years of age, of large build but slightly round-shouldered. His massive head momentarily shook a shock of reddish hair, which resembled a lion's mane. His face was short with a broad forehead, and furnished with a mustache as bristly as a cat's, and little patches of yellowish whiskers upon full cheeks. Round, wildish eyes, slightly nearsighted, completed a physiognomy essentially feline. His nose was firmly shaped, his mouth particularly sweet in expression, high forehead, intelligent and furrowed with wrinkles like a newly plowed field. The body was powerfully developed and firmly fixed upon long legs. Muscular arms and a general air of decision gave him the appearance of a hearty, jolly companion. He was dressed in a suit of ample dimensions, loose neckerchief, open shirt collar, disclosing a robust neck. His cuffs were invariably unbuttoned, through which appeared a pair of red hands. On the bridge of the steamer, in the midst of the crowd, he bustled to and fro, never still for a moment, dragging his anchors, as the sailors say, gesticulating, making free with everybody, biting his nails with nervous avidity. He was one of those originals which nature sometimes invents in the freak of a moment, and of which she then breaks the mold. Among other peculiarities, this curiosity gave himself out for a sublime ignoramus, like Shakespeare, and professed supreme contempt for all scientific men. Those fellows, as he called them, are only fit to mark the points, while we play the game. He was, in fact, a thorough bohemian, adventurous, but not an adventurer, a harebrained fellow, a kind of Icarus, only possessing relays of wings. For the rest, he was ever in scrapes, ending invariably by falling on his feet, like those little figures which they sell for children's toys. In a few words, his motto was, "I have my opinions," and the love of the impossible constituted his ruling passion. Such was the passenger of the Atlanta, always excitable, as if boiling under the action of some internal fire by the character of his physical organization. If ever two individuals offered a striking contrast to each other, these were certainly Mitchell Arden and the Impey Barbicane, both, moreover, being equally enterprising and daring, each in his own way. The scrutiny which the president of the gun club had instituted regarding this new rival was quickly interrupted by the shouts and hurrahs of the crowd. The cries became at last so uproarious, and the popular enthusiasm assumed so personal a form, that Mitchell Arden, after having shaken hands some thousands of times, at the imminent risk of leaving his fingers behind him, was fain at last to make a bolt for his cabin. Barbicane followed him without uttering a word. "You are Barbicane, I suppose," said Mitchell Arden in a tone of voice in which he would have addressed a friend of 20 years' standing. "Yes," replied the president of the gun club. "All right, how do you do, Barbicane? How are you getting on? Pretty well, that's right." "So," said Barbicane without further preliminary, "you are quite determined to go." "Quite decided." "Nothing will stop you." "Nothing. Have you modified your projectile according to my telegram?" "I waited for your arrival, but," asked Barbicane again, "have you carefully reflected?" "Reflected? Have I any time to spare? I find an opportunity of making a tour in the moon, and I mean to profit by it. There is the whole gist of the matter." Barbicane looked hard at this man who spoke so lightly of his project with such complete absence of anxiety. "But at least," said he, "you have some plans, some means of carrying your project into execution." "Excellent, my dear Barbicane. Only permit me to offer one remark. My wish is to tell my story once for all to everybody and then have done with it. Then there will be no need for recapitulation. So if you have no objection, assemble your friends, colleagues, the whole town, all Florida, all America if you like, and tomorrow I shall be ready to explain my plans and answer any objections whatever that may be advanced. You may rest assured I shall wait without stirring. Will that suit you?" "All right," replied Barbicane. So saying, the president left the cabin and informed the crowd of the proposal of Mitchell Arden. His words were received with clappings of hands and shouts of joy. They had removed all difficulties. Tomorrow every one would contemplate at his ease this European hero. However, some of the spectators, more infatuated than the rest, would not leave the deck of the Atlanta. They passed the night on board. Among others, J.T. Maston got his hook fixed in the coaming of the poop, and it pretty nearly required the capstan to get it out again. "He is a hero, he cried, a theme of which he was never tired of ringing the changes, and we are only like weak, silly women compared with this European." As to the president, after having suggested to the visitors it was time to retire, he re-entered the passengers' cabin and remained there till the bell of the steamer made it midnight. But then the two rivals in popularity shook hands heartily and parted on terms of intimate friendship. Chapter 19. A monster meeting. On the following day, Barbicane, fearing that indiscreet questions might be put to Mitchell Arden, was desirous of reducing the number of the audience to a few of the initiated, his own colleagues for instance. He might as well have tried to check the Falls of Niagara. He was compelled, therefore, to give up the idea and let his new friend run the chances of a public conference. The place chosen for this monster meeting was a vast plain situated in the rear of the town. In a few hours, thanks to the help of the shipping in port, an immense roofing of canvas was stretched over the parched prairie and protected it from the burning rays of the sun. There 300,000 people braved for many hours the stifling heat while awaiting the arrival of the Frenchman. Of this crowd of spectators, a first set could both see and hear. A second set saw badly and heard nothing at all, and as for the third, it could neither see nor hear anything at all. At 3 o'clock, Mitchell Arden made his appearance, accompanied by the principal members of the gun club. He was supported on his right by President Barbicane and on his left by J.T. Maston, more radiant than the midday sun and nearly as ruddy. Arden mounted a platform, from the top of which his view extended over a sea of black hats. He exhibited not the slightest embarrassment. He was just as gay, familiar, and pleasant as if he were at home. To the hurrahs which greeted him he replied by a graceful bow. Then, waving his hands to request silence, he spoke in perfectly correct English as follows. "Gentlemen, despite the very hot weather, I request your patience for a short time while I offer some explanations regarding the projects which seem to have so interested you. I am neither an orator nor a man of science, and I had no idea of addressing you in public, but my friend Barbicane has told me that you would like to hear me, and I am quite at your service. Listen to me, therefore, with your 600,000 ears, and please excuse the faults of the speaker. Now pray do not forget that you see before you a perfect ignoramus, whose ignorance goes so far that he cannot even understand the difficulties. It seemed to him that it was a matter quite simple, natural, and easy to take one's place in a projectile and start for the moon. That journey must be undertaken sooner or later, and as for the mode of locomotion adopted, it follows simply the law of progress. Man began by walking on all fours, then one fine day on 2 feet, then in a carriage, then in a stagecoach, and lastly by railway. Well, the projectile is the vehicle of the future, and the planets themselves are nothing else. Now some of you, gentlemen, may imagine that the velocity we propose to impart to it is extravagant. It is nothing of the kind. All the stars exceed it in rapidity, and the Earth herself is at this moment carrying us round the sun at 3 times as rapid a rate, and yet she is a mere lounger on the way compared with many others of the planets, and her velocity is constantly decreasing. Is it not evident, then, I ask you, that there will some day appear velocities far greater than these, of which light or electricity will probably be the mechanical agent? Yes, gentlemen, continued the orator, in spite of the opinions of certain narrow-minded people who would shut up the human race upon this globe, as within some magic circle which it must never outstep, we shall one day travel to the moon, the planets, and the stars with the same facility, rapidity, and certainty as we now make the voyage from Liverpool to New York. Distance is but a relative expression and must end by being reduced to 0. The assembly, strongly predisposed as they were in favor of the French hero, were slightly staggered at this bold theory. Mitchell Arden perceived the fact. "Gentlemen," he continued with a pleasant smile, "you do not seem quite convinced. Very good, let us reason the matter out. Do you know how long it would take for an express train to reach the moon? 300 days, no more. And what is that? The distance is no more than 9 times the circumference of the Earth, and there are no sailors or travelers of even moderate activity who have not made longer journeys than that in their lifetime. And now consider that I shall be only 97 hours on my journey. Ah, I see you are reckoning that the moon is a long way off from the Earth, and that one must think twice before making the experiment. What would you say, then, if we were talking of going to Neptune, which revolves at a distance of more than 2,720 millions of miles from the Sun? And yet what is that compared with the distance of the fixed stars, some of which, such as Arcturus, are billions of miles distant from us? And then you talk of the distance which separates the planets from the Sun. And there are people who affirm that such a thing as distance exists. Absurdity, folly, idiotic nonsense. Would you know what I think of our own solar universe? Shall I tell you my theory? It is very simple. In my opinion, the solar system is a solid, homogeneous body. The planets which compose it are in actual contact with each other, and whatever space exists between them is nothing more than the space which separates the molecules of the densest metal, such as silver, iron, or platinum. I have the right, therefore, to affirm, and I repeat, with the conviction which must penetrate all your minds, distance is but an empty name. Distance does not really exist. "Hurrah!" cried one voice. Need it be said it was that of J.T. Maston. Distance does not exist, and overcome by the energy of his movements, he nearly fell from the platform to the ground. He just escaped a severe fall, which would have proved to him that distance was by no means an empty name. "Gentlemen," resumed the orator, "I repeat that the distance between the Earth and her satellite is a mere trifle, and undeserving of serious consideration. I am convinced that before 20 years are over, 1/2 of our Earth will have paid a visit to the moon. Now, my worthy friends, if you have any question to put to me, you will, I fear, sadly embarrass a poor man like myself. Still, I will do my best to answer you. Up to this point, the president of the gun club had been satisfied with the turn which the discussion had assumed. It became now, however, desirable to divert Arden from questions of a practical nature, with which he was doubtless far less conversant. Barbicane, therefore, hastened to get in a word, and began by asking his new friend whether he thought that the moon and the planets were inhabited. "You put before me a great problem, my worthy president," replied the orator, smiling. "Still, men of great intelligence, such as Plutarch, Swedenborg, Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, and others have, if I mistake not, pronounced in the affirmative. Looking at the question from the natural philosopher's point of view, I should say that nothing useless existed in the world. And replying to your question by another, I should venture to assert that if these worlds are habitable, they either are, have been, or will be inhabited." "No one could answer more logically or fairly," replied the president. "The question then reverts to this: are these worlds habitable? For my own part, I believe they are." "For myself, I feel certain of it," said Mitchell Arden. "Nevertheless," retorted one of the audience, "there are many arguments against the habitability of the worlds. The conditions of life must evidently be greatly modified upon the majority of them. To mention only the planets, we should be either broiled alive in some, or frozen to death in others, according as they are more or less removed from the sun." "I regret," replied Mitchell Arden, "that I have not the honor of personally knowing my contradictor, for I would have attempted to answer him. His objection has its merits, I admit, but I think we may successfully combat it, as well as all others which affect the habitability of other worlds. If I were a natural philosopher, I would tell him that if less of caloric were set in motion upon the planets which are nearest to the sun, and more, on the contrary, upon those which are farthest removed from it, this simple fact would alone suffice to equalize the heat, and to render the temperature of those worlds supportable by beings organized like ourselves. If I were a naturalist, I would tell him that, according to some illustrious men of science, nature has furnished us with instances upon the earth of animals existing under very varying conditions of life, that fish respire in a medium fatal to other animals, that amphibious creatures possess a double existence very difficult of explanation, that certain denizens of the seas maintain life at enormous depths, and there support a pressure equal to that of 50 or 60 atmospheres without being crushed, that several aquatic insects, insensible to temperature, are met with equally among boiling springs and in the frozen plains of the polar sea. In fine, that we cannot help recognizing in nature a diversity of means of operation, oftentimes incomprehensible, but not the less real. If I were a chemist, I would tell him that the aerolites, bodies evidently formed exteriorly of our terrestrial globe, have, upon analysis, revealed indisputable traces of carbon, a substance which owes its origin solely to organized beings, and which, according to the experiments of Reichenbach, must necessarily itself have been endued with animation. And lastly, were I a theologian, I would tell him that the scheme of the divine redemption, according to St. Paul, seems to be applicable not merely to the earth, but to all the celestial worlds. But unfortunately, I am neither theologian, nor chemist, nor naturalist, nor philosopher. Therefore, in my absolute ignorance of the great laws which govern the universe, I confine myself to saying in reply, I do not know whether the worlds are inhabited or not, and since I do not know, I am going to see. Whether Mitchell Arden's antagonist hazarded any further arguments or not it is impossible to say, for the uproarious shouts of the crowd would not allow any expression of opinion to gain a hearing. On silence being restored, the triumphant orator contented himself with adding the following remarks. Gentlemen, you will observe that I have but slightly touched upon this great question. There is another altogether different line of argument in favor of the habitability of the stars, which I omit for the present. I only desire to call attention to one point. To those who maintain that the planets are not inhabited, one may reply, you might be perfectly in the right if you could only show that the Earth is the best possible world, in spite of what Voltaire has said. She has but one satellite, while Jupiter, Uranus, Saturn, Neptune have each several, an advantage by no means to be despised. But that which renders our own globe so uncomfortable is the inclination of its axis to the plane of its orbit. Hence the inequality of days and nights, hence the disagreeable diversity of the seasons. On the surface of our unhappy spheroid, we are always either too hot or too cold. We are frozen in winter, broiled in summer. It is the planet of rheumatism, coughs, bronchitis. While on the surface of Jupiter, for example, where the axis is but slightly inclined, the inhabitants may enjoy uniform temperatures. It possesses zones of perpetual springs, summers, autumns, and winters. Every Jovian may choose for himself what climate he likes, and there spend the whole of his life in security from all variations of temperature. You will, I am sure, readily admit this superiority of Jupiter over our own planet, to say nothing of his years, which each equal 12 of ours. Under such auspices and such marvelous conditions of existence, it appears to me that the inhabitants of so fortunate a world must be in every respect superior to ourselves. All we require, in order to attain such perfection, is the mere trifle of having an axis of rotation less inclined to the plane of its orbit. Hurrah! Roared an energetic voice. Let us unite our efforts, invent the necessary machines, and rectify the Earth's axis. A thunder of applause followed this proposal, the author of which was, of course, no other than J.T. Maston. And in all probability, if the truth must be told, if the Yankees could only have found a point of application for it, they would have constructed a lever capable of raising the Earth and rectifying its axis. It was just this deficiency which baffled these daring mechanicians. Chapter 20. Attack and Riposte. As soon as the excitement had subsided, the following words were heard uttered in a strong and determined voice. Now that the speaker has favored us with so much imagination, would he be so good as to return to his subject and give us a little practical view of the question? All eyes were directed toward the person who spoke. He was a little dried-up man of an active figure with an American goatee beard. Profiting by the different movements in the crowd, he had managed by degrees to gain the front row of spectators. There, with arms crossed and stern gaze, he watched the hero of the meeting. After having put his question, he remained silent and appeared to take no notice of the thousands of looks directed toward himself, nor of the murmur of disapprobation excited by his words. Meeting at first with no reply, he repeated his question with marked emphasis, adding, "We are here to talk about the moon and not about the earth." "You are right, sir," replied Mitchell Arden. "The discussion has become irregular. We will return to the moon." "Sir," said the unknown, "you pretend that our satellite is inhabited. Very good, but if Selenites do exist, that race of beings assuredly must live without breathing, for I warn you for your own sake, there is not the smallest particle of air on the surface of the moon." At this remark, Arden pushed up his shock of red hair. He saw that he was on the point of being involved in a struggle with this person upon the very gist of the whole question. He looked sternly at him in his turn and said, "Oh, so there is no air in the moon. And pray, if you are so good, who ventures to affirm that?" "The men of science." "Really? Really?" "Sir," replied Mitchell, "pleasantry apart, I have a profound respect for men of science who do possess science, but a profound contempt for men of science who do not. Do you know any who belong to the latter category?" "Decidedly. In France there are some who maintain that mathematically a bird cannot possibly fly, and others who demonstrate theoretically that fishes were never made to live in water. I have nothing to do with persons of that description, and I can quote, in support of my statement, names which you cannot refuse deference to. Then, sir, you will sadly embarrass a poor ignorant, who, besides, asks nothing better than to learn. Why then do you introduce scientific questions if you have never studied them?" asked the unknown somewhat coarsely. "For the reason that he is always brave who never suspects danger. I know nothing, it is true, but it is precisely my very weakness which constitutes my strength." "Your weakness amounts to folly," retorted the unknown in a passion. All the better, replied our Frenchman, if it carries me up to the moon. Barbicane and his colleagues devoured with their eyes the intruder who had so boldly placed himself in antagonism to their enterprise. Nobody knew him, and the president, uneasy as to the result of so free a discussion, watched his new friend with some anxiety. The meeting began to be somewhat fidgety also, for the contest directed their attention to the dangers, if not the actual impossibilities, of the proposed expedition. Sir, replied Arden's antagonist, there are many and incontrovertible reasons which prove the absence of an atmosphere in the moon. I might say that, a priori, if one ever did exist, it must have been absorbed by the Earth, but I prefer to bring forward indisputable facts. Bring them forward then, sir, as many as you please.